A few minutes into the flight, the same flight attendant returned, offering drinks. When she reached him, she hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice more careful now. "Water's fine," he said simply. She nodded, placing the bottle on his tray before quickly moving to the next passenger. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blue blazer leaned over slightly, just enough to get his attention. "What do you mean back there?" he asked. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was something curious about it. The pilot turned his head. "What do you mean?" "Check the name," the man repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You said that like you knew exactly what would happen." The pilot exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Because I did." The man studied him for a moment, then smirked. "You're somebody, aren't you?" The pilot didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sip of water and let the silence stretch between them. He had been flying planes for years, logging more hours in the air than most of the people on this flight had spent on vacations combined. And yet, sitting here, none of that mattered. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said softly from across the aisle. The pilot turned to see a young woman, probably in her early 30s, watching him with wide eyes. "Are you Captain Reynolds?" The man in the blazer frowned. The flight attendant, now a few seats away, stiffened slightly. A few passengers who had been half listening suddenly looked up. Reynolds nodded slowly. "I am." The woman let out a small breath, shaking her head. "I thought so. You flew my brother home once. He was in the military. You spoke to my family after the flight. I never forgot that." The cabin around them seemed to shrink for a moment. The tension from earlier hadn't vanished, but now it had changed into something else. Something heavier. The flight attendant glanced back, as if seeing him in a new light. But Reynolds knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because for every person who recognized his name, there were still plenty who would rather assume he didn't belong at all. The air inside the cabin felt different now. The murmurs had died down, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Captain Reynolds could feel it in the way people glanced at him, in the way the flight attendant avoided his eyes, in the way the man in the navy blue blazer suddenly sat up a little straighter. The woman across the aisle, the one who had recognized him, gave a small, apologetic smile. "I never got to thank you for what you did," she said. "You didn't have to stay with us that day, but you did. You made sure we were okay." Reynolds nodded, the memory coming back. He had flown hundreds of flights, but some stuck with him more than others. That one had been different. A soldier's final journey home. A grieving family waiting at the gate. He had made a point to speak with them, to offer what little comfort he could. It was never just about flying, it was about people. The man in the blazer cleared his throat. "So you're a pilot," he said slowly, as if piecing things together. Reynolds turned to him. "That a problem?" The man held up his hands. "No, just unexpected." Reynolds let the words hang there. Unexpected. He had heard it before, in different ways, from different people. Sometimes it was admiration, sometimes it was surprise, but more often than not, it was doubt. A few rows back, a passenger pressed the call button. The same flight attendant who had questioned him earlier hurried down the aisle. As she passed, her eyes flickered toward Reynolds before she quickly looked away. Then, out of nowhere, turbulence shook the plane. A quick, sharp jolt. Not unusual, but enough to make people stiffen in their seats. Reynolds barely reacted. He had spent years handling far worse. But what did catch his attention was a sudden, muffled commotion at the front of the cabin. The curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane shifted slightly, and for a brief second, Reynolds caught a glimpse of something, or someone, moving quickly. The flight attendant who had gone to check on the passenger didn't return right away. Another bump of turbulence rattled the plane. This time, Reynolds felt something else in the air, not just unease, but a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was wrong, and he wasn't the only one who noticed. Reynolds kept his eyes on the front of the cabin, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. The flight attendant who had gone to check on the passenger still hadn't returned, and now the curtain between first class and the rest of the plane had been pulled shut. That wasn't normal. It was supposed to be a normal evening out. J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, had just wrapped up a long day and was looking forward to a quiet meal at a popular restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a place to sit down, relax, and grab a bite. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air, almost like the staff had been expecting him, but not in a good way. A hostess approached, but instead of leading him to a table, she hesitated. Then, with a forced smile, she said something that instantly changed the mood. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here tonight." For a moment, there was silence. The people nearby, some already seated, some waiting for their turn, turned their heads. J.D. Vance stood there, processing what he had just heard. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't being disruptive. He had just walked in like any other customer. So why was he being turned away? At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a reservation issue. Maybe they were short on staff. But as the seconds passed, it became clear. This wasn't about logistics. This was personal. The hostess, though trying to keep her voice steady, looked uncomfortable, like she had been instructed to say those words. Vance asked the obvious question, "Why?" Again, hesitation. She glanced toward the manager standing a few feet away. The manager didn't step forward, didn't explain. Instead, they simply watched. And then, under her breath, the hostess admitted, "It's because of who you are." Now, the air grew even thicker. Whispers rippled through the restaurant. Some diners put down their forks, others pulled out their phones, sensing something big was unfolding. J.D. Vance, a sitting U.S. senator, was being denied service, not because of a reservation issue, not because the place was full, but because of his identity, his politics. For a brief second, you could see it in his face, shock, maybe a bit of disappointment. After all, isn't America built on the idea that people, no matter their differences, should be able to coexist, to share a meal without politics getting in the way? But then something unexpected happened. Instead of arguing, instead of raising his voice or calling for a boycott, J.D. Vance did something that caught everyone off guard. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and, well, what he did next left the entire restaurant stunned. And trust me, you won't believe what happened after that. Stay tuned. J.D. Vance stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. The restaurant had fallen into an eerie silence, with nearly every eye in the room locked on him. A few people whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Others just watched, waiting to see how he would react. He wasn't a stranger to criticism. Politics, after all, is a battleground. People disagree, they argue, they take sides. But being turned away from a restaurant, that was different. That wasn't a debate on the Senate floor or a heated exchange on social media. This was real life, happening in real time, and the weight of it pressed down on the entire room. The hostess, clearly uncomfortable, shifted nervously. She wasn't the one making the rules, that much was obvious. Her hands gripped the podium tightly, and she avoided direct eye contact. The manager, still standing a few feet away, seemed unsure whether to step in or stay back. It was as if no one expected J.D. Vance to actually show up that night, and now that he had, they weren't sure how to handle it. Vance finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "So, you're saying I can't eat here because of my politics?" The hostess hesitated again. It wasn't a question she wanted to answer. Finally, she said, "It's just, we've had complaints. Some people don't feel comfortable." There it was. Not a firm policy, not a written rule, just complaints. From who? Customers? Staff? No one was saying. The reasoning was vague, but the decision had already been made. The restaurant doors swung open, and a couple walked in, laughing about something before they realized a strange scene in front of them. They stopped short, looking around, trying to figure out what was going on. Others in the restaurant had pulled out their phones, subtly recording from behind menus or half-full glasses of wine. This was a moment that wasn't going to stay quiet for long. Vance looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces watching him. Some seemed uncomfortable, unsure of where they stood. A few people looked smug, like they approved of what was happening. But there were also others, people who looked just as shocked as he was. A man near the bar, middle-aged with a weathered face, leaned forward slightly, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. A woman at a nearby table gave Vance an apologetic look, shaking her head slightly as if to say, "Asterisk, this isn't right, asterisk." Another jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, but this time it felt different, not just a shake from rough air, but a shift in the energy of the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the man in the navy blue blazer, who had been so sure of himself a moment ago, now looked unsure. Reynolds had spent years reading the smallest details in the sky: wind shifts, storm patterns, warning signs. And right now, every instinct was telling him something was happening just beyond that curtain. Then, a sharp voice broke the silence. It was low, urgent. "Sit down," someone said from the front of the plane. Reynolds' grip tightened on the armrests. He could only hear bits and pieces, someone murmuring, a quiet shuffle of movement, but it was enough to put him on edge. He glanced toward the flight attendants still in the cabin, but they seemed tense, distracted, as if they knew something the rest of the passengers didn't. A few seats away, the woman who had recognized him whispered, "Do you hear that?" Reynolds gave a small nod. He wasn't the only one picking up on it. Then suddenly, the cockpit door opened just a crack. A flight attendant, one he hadn't seen before, stepped out. Her expression was tight, her movements stiff. She scanned the cabin quickly before disappearing behind the curtain again. That was it. Something was definitely wrong. Reynolds shifted in his seat, thinking. He could sit back and wait, pretend like he didn't notice, like it wasn't his concern. But that wasn't who he was. If something was happening on this flight, he needed to know what. Then, just as he made the decision to act, the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came on, but there was something off about it, too controlled, too careful. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected circumstances," the voice said, pausing slightly. "Please remain in your seats and follow all crew instructions." The cabin went still. Reynolds knew that tone. It wasn't just turbulence or a simple delay. The pilot wasn't just making an announcement, he was sending a message. Something was happening on this plane, and it was about to get worse. Reynolds felt his pulse steady as the captain's carefully measured words hung in the air. The passengers around him sat frozen, some exchanging worried glances, others gripping their armrests a little tighter. The man in the navy blue blazer leaned in again, this time his confidence replaced by uncertainty. "What do you think is going on?" he asked, his voice lower now. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He was focused on the curtain at the front of the cabin, on the way the flight attendants kept moving with forced calm, on the shift in energy that signaled something beyond just an ordinary in-flight issue. He had been in situations like this before. He knew when a pilot's voice carried something between the lines. Then movement. The curtain parted slightly, and Reynolds caught a glimpse of the flight attendant from earlier, her expression tight, her eyes scanning the cabin like she was looking for someone. A second later, her gaze landed on him. She hesitated, then stepped toward him quickly. "Sir," she said in a low voice, glancing around, "the captain needs you." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He had been right. This wasn't just turbulence, and it wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was happening, and for some reason, they needed him. Without a word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He could feel eyes on him as he followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane, slipping through the curtain. The moment it closed behind him, the air felt heavier. Inside the small galley near the cockpit, 2 more flight attendants stood stiffly, and just beyond them, the cockpit door was slightly ajar. The co-pilot, a young man who couldn't have been older than 30, stood just outside it, his face pale. Reynolds stepped closer, and when he peered into the cockpit, his stomach dropped. The captain was slumped forward, motionless. His breathing was shallow, his face slick with sweat. The controls blinked steadily, the plane still flying smoothly for now, but the real danger wasn't turbulence, it was the fact that they were down a pilot. Reynolds turned sharply to the co-pilot. What happened? He said he wasn't feeling well. The co-pilot stammered. Then he just collapsed. I don't know what's wrong. He swallowed hard. I can fly, but I've never landed a plane this size alone. Reynolds didn't need to think. His training took over. I can. The co-pilot's eyes widened. Wait, you're really... Reynolds was already stepping forward, settling into the captain's seat like it was second nature. His fingers flew over the controls, checking the instruments, adjusting the flight path. The plane was still steady, still on course, but without an experienced captain, things could go wrong fast. The moment he stepped onto the plane, he could feel the eyes on him. At first, he ignored it. He was used to it. Being a black pilot, he had spent years breaking barriers, proving himself, and earning his place in the skies. But today, he wasn't in uniform. Today, he was just another passenger, excited for a well-earned first-class flight. As he walked down the aisle, ticket in hand, he reached his seat, only to be met with a skeptical glare from the flight attendant. "Sir, I think you might be in the wrong section," she said, her voice polite but firm. He paused, taken aback. He had flown this airline countless times, even sat in this very section before, but something about her tone told him this wasn't a simple mistake. He smiled, handing over his boarding pass. "I'm in the right place," he assured her. She glanced at it, hesitated, then frowned. "I'll have to check with my supervisor," she muttered before disappearing down the aisle. Passengers around him shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to notice, others watching with curiosity. He could feel the weight of their unspoken thoughts. Was it because of his skin color? Was it because he didn't look like he belonged in first class? Minutes passed, and the attendant returned, this time with her supervisor. "Sir," the supervisor began, still holding his ticket, "are you sure you booked this seat?" The pilot took a deep breath, keeping his composure. This wasn't the first time he had faced something like this, but he wasn't about to let it slide. Then he said 3 simple words that changed everything. And in that moment, the entire plane went silent. The pilot looked straight at the supervisor, calm but firm. The words left his lips smoothly, without hesitation. "Check the name." The supervisor's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She glanced down at the boarding pass again, her expression shifting slightly as if realizing something. The flight attendant beside her looked over too, her confidence wavering. Passengers nearby were whispering now, curious but unsure whether to say anything. A man in a suit, 2 rows away, shook his head slightly, as if he had already decided how this would end. A woman clutching her purse just stared, waiting. The pilot stood his ground. He wasn't angry, he was tired. Tired of these moments, tired of having to prove himself over and over again. But most of all, he was tired of pretending it didn't matter. The supervisor cleared her throat, straightening her posture. "Sir, we're just making sure everything is in order," she said carefully. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "Of course, but would you ask anyone else up here the same question?" His voice was steady, but there was something underneath, something unmistakable. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. She knew the answer. They all did. A few rows back, an older man with grey hair and a worn leather bag spoke up. "If the man has a ticket, let him sit," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. A few people murmured in agreement, while others stayed quiet, not wanting to get involved. The pilot didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The supervisor hesitated for just a second longer before finally handing the ticket back. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, her voice now softer, almost apologetic. But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Because as the pilot took his seat and fastened his belt, he could still feel it. The tension hanging in the air, the weight of what had just happened. He had been questioned, doubted, singled out. And the real question was why? He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the flight crew made their final preparations. The engines hummed, the lights dimmed, and soon the plane would be in the sky. But something told him this flight was far from over. As the plane taxied down the runway, the pilot sat still, his hands resting on the armrests, but his mind was far from relaxed. He had spent years in the cockpit, guiding passengers safely across thousands of miles. But today in this seat, he was just another traveler, one who had been questioned, doubted, and made to feel like he didn't belong. Across the aisle, the flight attendant who had first confronted him was busy with last-minute checks, avoiding eye contact. Whether it was embarrassment or something else, he couldn't tell. A few rows back, the older man who had spoken up earlier gave him a small nod, a silent show of support. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice came over the speaker, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing the flight details. The pilot closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the familiar routine he had repeated so many times. But now, on the other side of it, things felt different.